Good afternoon, and welcome to today's Civil Dialogue. My name is Renee Littleton, and I'm the Senior Director of Marketing and Communications here at Arena Stage. The Civil Dialogues, created and curated by Professor Amitai Etzioni. Arena Stage is so pleased to partner with Professor Etzioni and host these community conversations that provide an opportunity for persons to engage in civil discourse about social and political issues with the goal, the ultimate goal, that individuals of diverse viewpoints can still have fruitful dialogues with one another. So today we're very excited to discuss a very hot topic right now, except for the children, childcare in schools if COVID-19 persists. Thank you for joining us, and I'm happy to turn this over to Professor Amitai Etzioni. Thank you and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Renee. It's a great pleasure to work with you on Arena Stage. 4 years, and I can't wait till we go back and do it on stage. And as Renee said, we have a tradition of having civil dialogues, and we had people from both sides of the aisle, believe it or not, having civil conversation. You can see the last 22 ones on YouTube. Today, let me get us started with two very quick comments. One, recently, some high-tech companies in Silicon Valley gave their employees who have children 6 weeks of paid leave to deal with the special problems which the pandemic created. And some other employees who have no children protested. And they argue that this is unfair, that they also have important issues to deal with. Now, on the one hand, I'm in favor of everybody getting, as many unpaid leaves days as possible, paid leaves as possible. But the question, nevertheless, is, are children special? Because that's really is the question. And my answer is, and I'm very keen to hear what the rest of you think, that first of all, there is a kind of a pragmatic consideration. And that is, as we see from society in which produce few children, in China because of the one-child policy, in Japan because of other reasons, that we have aging societies, the consequences of having few children are very dire for the whole society. Or to put it a little more dramatically, if you're going to go to war, who's going to fight the war if not the next generation? And somebody has to pay into Social Security, which of course we all know is dependent on the younger generation paying, so the older generation get paid. So even if you look at it strictly in dollar and cents terms and transactional terms, children are special. But frankly, and maybe again we're reading here my bias as a parent, I think children are special in a very more profound normative way. And the question is really how much society values children compared to other things. That's really what we're talking about, because we're going to talk about of all kind of programs which are expensive, and they really come back to the question about will they more efficiency, let's say, or children. And so that brings me to my second and last point. I'm not sure the issue can be really solved the way we see it today. And here's why. If you go back to 1970, where a working class person, not all, but many, let's say somebody working on the assembly line in one of the car companies would be paid in those days $24, let's say, an hour, and have a rich array of benefits. You could have one person working and financing a household. Now, it's true that this was discriminatory against women because women were the ones who were delegated to work at home. But what happened next is, as real wages stayed stagnant, more and more people in the household had to work in order to keep at the same level of income. And so now we had basically 1.7, but to put it simply, most parents had not to work outside the household in order to finance the household. And then came the question, how are we going to pay for childcare. So I think now we can, of course, take part of the income of one of the parents and pay to somebody else to do the parenting. But the issue, in my judgment, cannot resolve unless you go back to a situation where one of the two parents is paid enough, so if necessary, the other parent can stay home. It reflects an inadvertent decision the society made that in order to get us ever more consumer goods, where the privileged half, there's a half which just can make ends meet for basic needs, but there's a whole half which buy all kind of stuff, like flat TVs, which in effect we collectively chose instead of investing in children. So with that somewhat dire introduction, given the context that we're not going to change that over the next 2 years or 4, the question is, given the pandemic going to stay with us, I think we should take it for granted. What can we do to allow families and be able to work to finance their household, but also attend to the children under new conditions, especially the young children. So our tradition is to go the first round alphabetically and ask you to introduce yourself. So why would we start with Israel?
Thank you very much, Professor. My name is Elizabeth Cassio, and I'm an economist. I've worked at Dartmouth for most of my career, and one of my main areas of research has been at the nexus of childcare and education. And a common theme here has been that schools provide childcare and childcare centers also educate. But another common theme in my research, which really emphasizes history, is that it's been our history and our politics that have created a really hard line between the two. And perhaps we'll have time to get into that discussion, but because there is a hard line, for example, in terms of who is doing the funding, which level of government, whether the program is universal, how vast the inequalities are, it means that the pandemic kind of shocks to these sectors, to the childcare sector, which we want to think about children under the age of 5, and the education sectors, we want to think about school-age children, have really been quite distinct. And that probably means that any solutions that we propose, any way forward in the current environment, will need to be aware of and have some respect for those differences. And I want to go into my suggestions for what we might do, but just as a little aside, as an economist, how I have thought about these issues is, not so much, although it is important, about how important are children. I mean, I feel like this is a question, how important is it to invest in children? I can estimate returns on investment from, say, early education, but it's really up to the political system, okay, to make these decisions about how much we want to invest as a society. But as an economist, I can tell you that not only can those returns be high, but also that there is a strong theoretical need here for some sort of government intervention, because we can't go to the bank and borrow money to send our children to childcare. And the amount of money that it costs to do this is phenomenal. It's much more than the typical household, especially with young children, can afford. The reason why, of course, we can't go to the bank is there's no collateral. The bank's not going to give us a loan for this. So there's a vast, what we like to call market failure here. Now, how exactly, that market failure, would be best addressed is perhaps kind of where the debate really lies. So if I had a wish list, it would actually start with the political question, which I think, if I were to advise, the next Congress, the next president, what is most important right now, I would say pass a new Voting Rights Act. A central provision of the 1965 Act was gutted by the Supreme Court in 2013 in the Shelby County versus Holder decision. And this isn't just the right thing to do to preserve democracy, but broader based electoral accountability is going to lead to policies that are also broader based in their benefits and also more fair. Okay, so more at the topic at hand. Second, I think we need to staunch the bleed that's happened here so far. Just sort of, we're in a triage kind of emergent situation where the bleeding is still, the blood is still gushing here. So what do I mean here? I mean, get money out to school districts in a way that they're suffering financially because of financial losses or tax revenue, reductions in tax revenue at the state level, as well as the local level. And the costs of education, especially in person, also remote with computing and so on, are going up. So, there's strong financial need, and this is precisely the type of situation where it would make sense for the federal government to step in with a large aid package. This really should have happened back in June, at least, to get schools through this difficult period and in a flexible way. Also, in terms of staunching the bleed, in terms of childcare centers, even in the private sector, most of these centers operate in such a way that profit margins are quite thin, despite the expense. So that means that many centers are on the margin of survival, and keeping them open is important for the parents who can afford to send their children there, as well as for the other parents who can take advantage of them through the subsidy programs that do exist. And third, and this is where I'm going to get a little bit more, uncertain. I think we need to, implement some sort of new vision for a federal role in childcare, but one which respects this idea of flexibility. So President Obama back in 2013 had this idea for universal preschool for all, that never really got off the ground. But it was one of the aspects of this policy, and I'm not saying that this is exactly the thing that should be adopted, but one of the aspects about it was kind of respecting how the federal government has typically intervened in educational matters, putting some money on the table, doing it in a way based on categorical aid, and setting some goals for how that money should be used, but otherwise allowing for a great deal of flexibility. So that would be one thing. Now, the problem with expanding, childcare, essentially preschool to 4-year-olds, is you're taking away part of the childcare sector, basically, which is the profitable part for private centers, because older children cross-subsidize the younger ones. So I don't have a great solution for that yet, but I'm curious about what the other panelists think.
I think do I have the alphabet correct? No, Lynette, I think you can, I guess next.
Yeah.
We can just move on. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Professor Etzioni, for inviting me to participate in the civil dialogue. I'm already thrilled just by virtue of the introductions. I'm excited to join all of this distinguished panel and talk about not only the system that we have lived in, but the system that we're going to want to live in as it relates to childcare. So my name is Lynette Fraga, and I am the CEO at Childcare Aware of America. It's a national nonprofit organization that leads projects that increase the quality and availability of childcare. And we conduct research and advocate for childcare policies that positively impact the lives of children and families. And there are a few key points I want to make, and some in response to what I've already heard. So firstly, I just want to make a key point that our childcare system was fractured and near breaking before the pandemic, and now it's broken. So what has really happened is there's been shortcomings in our nation's childcare system exacerbated by the pandemic. which is really underscoring the precariousness of the current system, the challenges in attaining high quality, affordable, raised earlier by my former panelists, and accessible childcare for families are the results of years of underinvestment in the system. And we're hearing from so many families and so many providers, and I want to raise up their voices a bit in my introductory comments. Parents like Kate from Oregon, who was accessing childcare as an essential worker, and 2 weeks after she went back to work, the childcare program closed down. 2 weeks later, she went to try and find another childcare program, which she was ultimately successful in doing. However, that childcare program is also teetering on collapse because they can't make the economic calculus work for her small business. And so she's now continuing to scramble for care for her 2 young children. And of course, this causes a great deal of stress and worry for herself, certainly for her family, and obviously affects children. And she's worried about her safety, her children's safety, and her own family safety and the development of her children as they try to access quality care. So that's, I think, something in a voice we have to continue to bring into the conversation. The second point I want to raise is that we do need investment. Without childcare, there is no recovery. Families need childcare in order to go to work. Prior to the pandemic, over 12 million children in the United States between the ages of birth to 5 had regularly participated in some form of childcare. And so that is a lot of children. We add school agers, as we have thought about school age care in a very different way, and I think out of school time through this pandemic, and really understand what it means, no matter the age of your child, what care and nurturing means for our communities as not only a child development and education support, but also as an economic engine. So we're also hearing from providers, for example, Lisa in Mississippi, who has kept her center open throughout the pandemic. And she's had to deal with incredibly reduced enrollment, much of it due to either families feeling uncomfortable taking their children back to care, or because it takes so much money, and rightly, to meet public health requirements, smaller group sizes, increased number of staff, et cetera. But it does cost more to provide care. And as Elizabeth said earlier, the margins of profit are already razor thin prior to the pandemic, and this really is breaking a lot of providers. And unfortunately, what we're seeing is across the country, anywhere between 30 to 50% of childcare providers across the country may close permanently due to the pandemic. So let that sit in for a moment. Potentially up to half of our childcare programs may close in the United States due to the COVID-19 and the fact that they can't make that business calculus work, whether they provide care as a private center or family childcare home, or whether they're providing care to children who are receive subsidy, or both. Really looking at challenges. And the third point I'd like to raise up is the federal policy response. It's clear that we're facing a possible collapse of the childcare system. Providers are struggling, parents are struggling, many are closing. You know, in the short term, we need for there to be significant investment in emergency childcare stabilization funding. I mean, absent this funding, we're really going to run into tremendous challenges. We at Child Care Aware of America are raising up $50 billion in relief just to stabilize the childcare sector. But in the longer term, taking that magic wand, Professor Etzioni, that you passed along in terms of our wish list, we do need investment at the federal and the state level that raises up not only childcare and early childhood programs as an economic engine and support for families who need support to go back to work. All of these millions of children who are even from the ages of birth to 5 who need a safe nurturing space to be while their parents work or go to school. But we really need to also ensure the understanding of what we know about the science of early childhood, which brings me to my last point. the science of early childhood is really clear and strong. We know that the first years of life are a critical period for brain development that lays the foundation for lifelong health, learning, and behavior. Elizabeth raised up, and maybe I should call you Dr. Cassio, raised up the fact that we can think about from an economics perspective the return on investment. If we invest now, we're investing in children of the future who will be workers in the future, increased productivity, reduced crime. There's a calculus around improved health, savings on health when children get older, et cetera. So it's really critical to sort of know and understand that. So as I'm thinking about my wish list, I'm thinking about, firstly, that solutions need to be considered through the lens of what we know about the science of early childhood from birth and prenatally, and follow our investments with that knowledge of the science. I think secondly, we need to listen to and center our solutions and the children and families that we're supporting and their lived experiences. We have a very diverse country, and we also have significant disparities. And oftentimes those disparities run around racial lines. We have to raise up the fact that as we're thinking about solutions, how are we thinking about the diverse cultures and communities and individuals and systems and structure that have to be addressed holistically and head on? And also thirdly, as we're thinking about how we solve this issue, I think one of the challenges that instead of thinking about what children need from birth, we need to be thinking about what we know about the science of child development from birth through school age and beyond, and how we can make sure that our systems are supporting child development in the science and not vertical funding streams and arbitrary programs that may not be honoring the continuum of learning for early childhood. And so I really feel like we need to think very deliberately about how our science of early childhood is contributing to the systems rather than the other way around, and set up systems absent what we know about how children learn and develop and how children and families thrive within communities.
Rachel, I think it's your turn to go.
I think that's right. Yes, I'm Rachel Gordon, a professor of sociology and a policy scholar at the University of Illinois at Chicago. I've studied early care and education for 2 decades plus, many different topics, most recently the quality of care settings, but also access to settings and inequities, parental employment, as well as supporting children for school readiness. And I'll echo and expand on some of the things that have been said so far. First of all, I'm excited to think about advising a new president, and I think we're going to need to be bold and big and have all hands on deck. I've spent 2 decades working with legislators, especially legislators in my state, and I know they want simple answers. I'm not going to give a simple answer though. I know that some of the things we need to do are to build on the kind of dialogue we're having here, community dialogues. I've worked on adversarial collaboration. How can we bring different groups together? And this early care and education system that we had, that Lynette mentioned, was already fractured, is multi-layered, multifaceted. For young children under 5, we have parents, grandparents, neighbors, friends, family child care, private care centers, school-based centers, church-based centers, a whole variety of places that kids are getting care. And we were moving toward universal preschool, which is an important, essential piece for children. One of our most stable findings is that a touch with center-based childcare for 3- and 4-year-olds leads to more academic school readiness. So this was a really important movement. One of the complications that I study as a sociologist, though, is how, and Elizabeth mentioned this. We push down on one piece of that multifaceted system, something may push up in another area. So we were moving toward often full day center-based care for 3 and 4-year-olds, and that sometimes was crowding out other places in the care system. So there may be an opportunity, as we are going to have to stop the bleed, to also think anew about what we can do to best serve parents in the 21st century and children in the 21st century. One of the things that we've seen in my work in Illinois is that the needs of parents, especially those who work evening and weekend, may not match up with what their children need. And center-based preschool often is during the day, historically part day, and parents may then need childcare in the evening and on the weekend, and may not want to be away from the child in all of those periods of time. So we actually studied parents who were combining both kinds of care for 3 and 4-year-olds, and a pilot that was doing that in Illinois. So thinking about these kinds of models, I think, is a place where we have an opportunity. We do know that we have a crisis in the making. We already know from school-based research that we have a summer setback, and that exacerbates inequities. And what that means is that when kids are not in school in the summer, those who were making progress during the school year, some of them stall out in the summer when they don't have access to resources and inputs at home, and that exacerbates disparities. And we're starting to see conversation about the ways this may be happening. We may be having a COVID setback. Parents with more resources who may be hiring in local pods or tutors, former teachers. How are all children getting access to what they need? We know very little about the quality of remote access to learning and who has access to that to begin with, if they have Wi-Fi, if they have computers. There was a nice study from a national organization near at Rutgers looking at these kinds of disparities in what was happening to kids last spring and summer when childcare centers and preschools shut down. So we're going to need a major investment to close that gap, that COVID setback that we're going to be dealing with. And it's likely that this budgetary crisis is going to stay with us and raise up, as we've seen in prior recessions, if we don't have this kind of massive influx. The last 2 points I want to make, as a sociologist, I study inequities, and one that we looked at recently in my team was gender differentials in the kind of care children attend and the benefits that they get from different kinds of childcare settings. We know there are important inequities by race, ethnicity, by socioeconomic status, and these are multi-layered together. I mentioned gender in particular because we also are seeing evidence of the strains of caregiving differentially by those who identify as female and male. So really attending to where these setbacks are happening and where the strains are hitting families. The final point I'd have us think about is some work that colleagues and I have been looking at what's called by sociologists the school improvement industry. These is the important network of organizations, companies, individuals that provide to early care and education settings and school settings the textbooks, the tests, the learning management systems that they deal with. And these are important but complicated. What we've been thinking about is how those products are made and how that relates to their cost, quality, and adaptability. And of course, before COVID, we were thinking about data systems and who owns the data and has access to the data. And this increase in online systems and who's providing those and how schools and early care settings have access and maybe locking into longer term patterns is something that I'd like to see us discuss more.
Would you please?
Yes, hi. So thank you so much for having me. My name is Bridget Schulte. I am a writer and a journalist, and I'm the director of the Better Life Lab at New America. We're the Work, Family Justice, and Gender Equity program at it's a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. And we do a lot of work around research and shared narratives, if you will. Like, what are the stories that we tell ourselves? And so I guess I'd like to start there. You know, just pulling on so many of the wonderful things and the important things that my fellow panelists have just, these important points that they've just made. I guess the first thing I'd say is, where is the outrage? You know, Lynette has said nearly half of the childcare system might be disappearing forever. Why are people not out on the streets? Why are there not front page articles about this? Why are people not screaming about it? So this is, you know, and so you have to really think, you know, it was broken before. It's, you know, as a journalist, it's very difficult to get these kinds of stories on the front page. I would say there's been more writing about it. There's been more awareness in the past few months than there has been in the last several years. When I first came to New America, one of the first things that we did, and Lynette has been a fantastic partner with us, we put together the New America Care Report, and we looked at the cost, quality, and availability of childcare in all 50 states, kind of came up with a methodology and really used it as a tool for some storytelling. And I have to tell you, there is so much confusion out there. People do not understand how the childcare system works, or let me say, does not work. I can't tell you how many parents would say, it's like, well, somebody's got to be flying a private plane because it's so expensive. Somebody's got to be making money. People do not understand that childcare is so expensive because it takes a lot of people to do it well. You can have one kindergarten teacher teach 30 children in some states. But if you're talking about infants, or if you're talking about 2 or 3 year olds, you're talking about one teacher for maybe 3, 4, 5, or 6 kids. So it just takes a lot more people to do. Now, the other thing that I think people do not understand is that parents pay the bulk of the cost of childcare. And for some people, you know, the federal standard for what is affordable is 7% of your income. Well, I don't know if anybody pays that. You know, that's what other countries, that's the standard in other countries. You know, some people maybe pay 10. If you look, you know, at single parents or people without means or resources, they're paying sometimes up to 30% of their income on childcare. It is completely unsustainable. And you do not have 18 years to save up for, you know, like you do in college. You know, we did this, and a number of other economists have done this, that the cost of infant care is more expensive than the cost of in-state college tuition in more than half of the states in the United States. I mean, that's insane. That is such a burden to families. And nobody is, like, again, why are we not out on the streets and screaming about it? And we're not out on the streets screaming about it because people are struggling to just try to get to the end of the day. And because we have a massive failure of imagination in this country about what childcare is or could be and how we could really support working families, working parents, working caregivers. You know, you made an important point earlier. You'd said, oh, well, you know, childcare, we're having somebody else, we're paying somebody else to parent our children. I think that's the absolute wrong way to think about this, although that is a very common, culturally sort of acceptable way to think about childcare, that you're, you know, in the early era of sort of the mommy wars, you had conservative writers talk about, you know, women will just drop their children off like poodles at a, you know, at a kennel when they drop them off at childcare. I bring this up because I think that the other point that I want to make, the outrage is one. The other point that I think is sort of the elephant in the room is that childcare, one of the other reasons why there isn't more attention, there isn't more outrage, the bottom line is this is about gender and this is about race. And those are very difficult things for us to talk about in a realistic way. Just for instance, when I was reporting on my book about why things are so difficult for working families, it's called Overwhelmed. And here I'm a person with, resources, and I've got education, and I was about to lose my mind just trying to work and have 2 kids. And I just thought, how on earth are we doing this? How are people doing this and not losing their minds? And I really wanted to understand, well, why do we have such crummy policies? Why do we have no policies really that support working families? And so I was able to trace it back. And, Professor Etzioni, you mentioned this in the early 1970s. It was a real turning point in the world, really. There was this massive, globalization, stagnating wages. Women entered the workforce en masse because the women's movement opened up opportunities on the one hand, but because of that falling family wage, as you mentioned, many women had to go into the workforce just to maintain that same standard of living. And so all of a sudden you had all available parents working. And I think this is the other thing that's important to recognize. The majority of children in the United States are being raised in families where all available parents are working. So this is not like, we're dropping the kids off so that we can go and be self-actualized. This is, this is survival. This is, we've got sort of really crappy jobs that a lot of people are trying to make ends meet, working 2 and 3 jobs. We've made it really impossible for families. So I wanted to try to understand, well, like, how did we get here? And so I went and I talked to Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan was a speechwriter for Richard Nixon. He was part of sort of the emerging far right in the late 60s, early 70s. And so I went to his house. He lives in the suburbs of Northern Virginia. You walk in, he has a gigantic portrait of Robert E. Lee on the walls there. And I wanted to try to understand, he almost single-handedly ended what could have been a universal, high quality, easily accessible childcare system on a sliding scale that everyone could have benefited from. Really an emphasis on quality, an emphasis on investment. It was a bipartisan. So back when Republicans and Democrats could actually speak to each other without hurling rocks, they were on the same side. Richard Nixon's, his own administration was working behind the scenes to shape the bill. It was known that he would support it. It was sort of a no-brainer. Everyone else around the world was doing this in developed economies. The Harris and Gallup polls showed that there was massive support. It's like, wow, the world is really changing. Families need our support. The government needs to be part of the solution. We need to think about childcare the way we think about education. We do not expect parents to pay for K through 12 education because we've decided that's a public good. But for some reason, 0 to 5, we haven't made that decision yet. So when I talk about my wish list is for a massive mindset shift, going back to what Pat Buchanan took us in the 1970s and steered us off on this kind of far right path. I want us to come back. I want us to be able to ask these questions. I want us to be able to have conversations about what is it that we value and how can we come together and support the future? How can we think about this as an investment? So when I talked to Pat Buchanan, he said, he had just come back from a trip to the Soviet Union, and this was at the height of the Cold War. And he was terrified that he's like, childcare would destroy the family. And he said, if you want to work, that's fine. You want me to pay for it? No way, Jose. He said that. I quoted him. So there was this sense early on that family was a private matter. And the feminist economist Nancy Folbury had said that began this notion that children are like pets and you can only have them if you can afford them. And so again, Professor Etzioni, you raised some really important points about this idea of, look at falling birth rates, look at aging societies, how do we shift that mindset? How do we steer the narrative back from families are private, government has no role, to really expanding this notion, expanding our imagination. And really one of the things that we're thinking about at the Better Life Lab is, what is the Marshall Plan for childcare? Universal, high quality, easily accessible childcare in this country. How do we get there? How do we have these conversations? One of the other things that I run into a lot of when I do my reporting is, you know, this has been so hard for families for so long. What you'll do is you get people who've gone through basically the gauntlet, and they'll say, well, I did it, so why can't you? So we have this sort of like pull up the the drawbridge kind of mentality, because so many other parents have suffered. I guess what we want everybody else to suffer. So this is where, my wish list is for our brains and our minds and our imagination to really expand the sense of the possible. And the last couple of points that I want to make, you talked about the situation at Facebook, and how do we organize systems where parents don't feel like that we're not just advantaging parents to everyone else's detriment. I think a couple of things that I would say about that is, one, we need to think about care and caregiving. And that means caring for children. That means caring for aging parents. That means caring for ourselves. And so again, expanding that notion of who needs time off of work to do what and to care for themselves. And the other thing that I would say is, why do we think that the way we work is sacrosanct? Why aren't we rethinking how our work systems work? Why does working all the time and in an office and 9 to 5, everything that the COVID pandemic is showing is basically disrupting? I think it's time to have those kinds of conversations. How do we disrupt work that is still so very much modeled on a 1950s breadwinner homemaker era? How do we disrupt it so it actually supports the real lives that people are living in the 21st century? So I'd be happy to go further, but I just think we need to set the table with outrage, with gender. We have this notion, the general social surveys, we still have this for a large plurality of people. They still think that, mothers should be the ones at home, ignoring all sorts of research about how important fathers are and how they are also wired for nurture. But I also think, Lynette mentioned we are a very racially diverse country. This is the last point that I'll make. And we have to look directly at that so many, we do not support our families. Going back to Pat Buchanan, one of the arguments that he made is that universal childcare would be about race mixing and really playing on people's fears. And I think it's time, again, to let that structural racism go and really come together and embrace all of our children.
Wow, this has been absolutely excellent survey, and all the points have been covered well. That's why I didn't interrupt you guys as well. You ate up a good part of our time just with the introductory statements, but I didn't want to cut any of this short because it all was on target. And there seems to be a consensus that we need to invest more in children, and I mean not invest in the narrow economic sense, but in the sense of valued children, not by speeching, but aligning our budgets in line with our moral commitments. So I just, in the remaining minutes we have, I'd like to see if I could put you on one narrow question. And this one I will need to ask you each for a brief and sharp comment. And I'm going to act here as a devil's advocate, or maybe it's a child advocate, you decide. So we talked earlier about the importance of the first year, or the first 2 years, let's say. Are we really sure that the best way to go, if you had a magic lever, to put this money in institutionalizing more children, in putting them into childcare centers, especially now with COVID? Or should some of that money go to parent pods and parent cooperatives? Let me just elaborate this for a moment. It's not, I'm talking about academic skills in the first 2 years of life. I think the most important thing is bonding. It doesn't have to be the mothers, it can be the father, it can be the grandmother. But if a child does not bond, I think neither social nor academic development will take place. Now, when we go into the childcare centers, with the turnover of personnel and the kind of personnel, many of them are higher, it's like losing your mother every 8 months, or your father, if you wish. Because of the moment the child bonds with one of the childcare centers, they are gone and a new one comes in. And to really push the point, in one of the childcare centers, some of them are for profit, of course, child care center went to a junkyard and bought a lot of the seats from cars and then seat belted the children to the chairs in order to take care of them, or to put it in a more elegant language. They basically saw the job as custodial care. Their job is to keep the children safe, not to educate. So the question is, and I'm pushing it a little, but if let's talk about the young children. Should we put the money mainly only into trying to create a French system? Do we really have the resources, even with money, to give every child a quality care, which could be substitute for parenting? Or should we think about making parenting more affordable, especially now that many parents are concerned that putting the children in institution adds a health risk? So let's go with the opposite order this time, but I need to ask you each to be brief. Bridget, let's start with you.
Okay, I'll try to be brief because I know I got a little carried away. I'm sorry. You can tell I feel very passionate about this.
Sorry, you did fine.
So I guess the first couple of things that I would say is, when we talk about infant care, and how expensive infant care is, I think one of the things that other developed countries do is that's what paid family and medical leave is. Adequate of duration for both parents, through 6 months to a year. That's how you handle infant care, which is such a huge cost. So I think that's one of the first things that we could and should do: universal paid family leave, a national policy around that. To your other points,
we're talking about a year or year and a half paid leave, the way many other countries do. That's what you're talking about, right?
Yes, 6 months to 1 year. Yeah, ideally. We're lucky. Right now we have an emergency 12-week paid leave that's going to expire December 31st and has so many exemptions. As my colleague Vicky Shabo says, you could drive a truck through them. So we have a long way to go, but that's a good start. I think it's really important. You were talking about the high turnover and custodial care. I think that you have to understand that, we talk about we don't want to subsidize the childcare system. We already are subsidizing the childcare system on the backs of early care educators and teachers and care workers who earn poverty wages. So you absolutely, if you want to have higher quality, you want to have that bonding and attachment, what's called serve and return kind of warm interaction, then you absolutely need to have decent, dignified work for our early educators and teachers, and that does require investment. And that, I think, is one of the most important things that we could do. Important for teachers, important for family, important for stability, important for that child development and that bonding. And I guess the last thing that I would say, just because you've said this a couple times, that caregiving is a substitute for parenting, it's not. It's an addition to parenting. I felt really guilty when I put my 2 children in childcare, and I remember the childcare director said, "You are their mother. You are their parent. You will always be their parent." And I think it's really, again, it's very important. We tend to stigmatize parents, and particularly mothers who use childcare. It's not a substitute for parenting, but it helps you parent. It helps you combine your work and life.
So I think I'm next, yes. And I am glad you asked this question, because I was trying to allude to the plurality of care contexts and the ways in which there's not enough that we know about lifting up quality across all of those settings and how they may be combined in ways that are beneficial to parents and children. So I think we have an opportunity to keep thinking about that more. I may have heard a little bit of maybe this is less expensive. I don't know that it's less expensive. It's valuable to invest highly in children's care, whatever context they're in. It may not be full day center-based care for every child. One of my colleagues has been working on a Math at Home initiative to help family child care providers provide math learning in the homes, for instance. So there's lots of ways that children can grow and benefit in family childcare settings with parents and in center-based care. So I would return us to thinking about that plurality and thinking about your question, but not that it's necessarily less expensive.
Lynette?
So I want to re-emphasize what Brigid said. Absolutely, paid family leave, that's part of the equation and should be part of the way in which we think about care from birth on 6 months or a year or more. I do want to make a question or make a statement about this idea of custodial care, because we not only need to care about children, we need to care about those individuals who are caring for children. And in the United States, we don't do that. We don't respect our caregivers. And I think we need to put more respect on caregivers. With many childcare workers in 2019 making $11.65 an hour, it's very evident that we don't put the level of respect we want on those individuals who are providing care and education during such a critical moment in time. Nearly 15% of childcare workers live below the artificially low official poverty line, more than double the rate of other industries. So that really tells you that we're not thinking about the caregiver and respecting the caregiver in the ways that we want to. And I really want to take this minute just to say this as well. The disproportionate impact on women of color in the childcare community and industry. Women of color represent 20% of the United States population and 40% of the 1.5 million childcare workers in the United States. Most caregivers, early childhood educators, are also women. So I want to raise this back up to Bridget's beginning comments that we are talking not only about investing in children, but also raising the importance of the individuals who are caring for those children, not forgetting that there is institutional challenges here, both in gender and in race, that we have to meet head on in order to really resolve and think about the art of the possible in service to our children and families.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, it's good to go last here because I feel like so much ground was covered. But when you asked the question, I kind of wrote it down here. One of the things that Bridget said, I don't think of childcare, institutionalized childcare as being a substitute for parenting at all. The other, I mean, I feel like it's complementary. I learned a lot about being a good parent from my children's childcare providers. However, it was a very, very good center, with relatively low turnover. So another way of approaching this question is to think about exactly like how are we treating and thinking about the people who work in this sector? How do we provide them with professional development opportunities that allow them to be the best caregivers that they can be? Another thing that popped into my mind when you asked the question is sort of how have other countries addressed this issue? Not only do we rank essentially last in the OECD in terms of the fraction of 4-year-olds in any kind of school program. We're between Mexico and Turkey, if you want to know for sure there. We also have like the least generous, essentially non-existent kind of family leave policy in the United States. I think there is a sweet spot with family leave. When you start getting beyond, say, a year, I think that we start running into issues of women actually not returning to work at all. Even in places with really aggressive, family leave and childcare policies, a woman having her first child is the biggest hit she will take in terms of her income, and it does not go away. There's a great piece from Denmark showing this. It is a huge hit, and it remains. Men and women look very similar in terms of earnings until the first child is born, and then boom. So, I don't want to be just that, pragmatic economist here, just talking about like, oh, it's really in the best interest of children for their moms to stay at work. But there is something lost to the economy whenever we can't figure out a way to allow or to help women and men, but women in particular, to be both parents and to have careers. And we make this virtually impossible in this country by the choices that we've made. So there is like outrage here. And I've had the same thought, I'm on Twitter or something, I'm thinking, why aren't people more angry about this? I mean, we're all so tired, those of us who have small children, and mine are getting older, but they're still kind of small. And I think there's just this expectation that we're going to be able to figure it out. And maybe we can return to, the history and the politics here, because I think it's so important. That's why I was shaking my head so much when Brigid was speaking about Pat Buchanan being the voice in Richard Nixon's ear that got, the Child Care and Development Act vetoed, when it did not seem like that was going to happen. So I don't want to sort of steer us too much in that direction. But can I make one more point?
Please do.
Just in terms of like reaction to things that I've heard. I mean, I don't disagree with this idea that we need to go big. We need a Marshall Plan. You need so many things. I think that one impediment to thinking about education and childcare in the same way is that mass education was a distinctly American idea that arose organically at the local level in this country by families pooling their resources through, for example, property tax-based finance that allowed families in the same community who knew each other to effectively borrow from each other over the course of the life cycle. Okay, that's how we solve that problem that you can't go to the bank to borrow money to educate your child. Okay. So I think the question I would ask is, how do we create a system of pooling resources here that works politically in this country to make this happen? And so I think that is sort of a resistance. It took over 100 years to get kindergartens into every public school in this country. It happened, okay, but it took over a century. Okay, and we're on the upswing now with preschool, but it's still kind of flattened out in recent years. The Great Recession, the situation that we're in now, is not going to help at all. So, so if left, decentralized, we're going to keep probably ratcheting down what school age means in this country, but it will take centuries. So the question is, how do we want federal government to sort of get involved to accelerate that process and to support it?
Well, I very much hope it will not take a century.
We have history here telling us that that's what's happening.
I understand. I hear you. And indeed, this idea of, on the one end, giving parents at least a year paid leave, and then adding childcare is clearly the direction we need to go. I'll take my moderate hat off for 30 seconds and suggest that since we're talking about large new expenditures, and a responsible panel will have to say what you're going to cut, because otherwise, we are not completing the argument, let me put it that way. And so I'm just have one suggestion, which I'm surprised, frankly, not to have heard in this election cycle, and that would be defund not the police but the military. No, but I don't really mean defund, but I mean we have been very lavish on spending on the military, and I think if we have to make choices, that's one place I would go as if I would be a member of the panel rather than a moderator. So now to turn to my moderating role, we're going to bring in now people who have wonderful questions. So let me ask you not to turn off your mics. So we really have, if you want to chuckle or be more like a conversation, please make your answers short, and not all four of you have to answer all things. Please remember that you want other people to have a chance to ask you questions as pointedly as possible. So let's bring in the first people who are going to join the conversation.
Hi, we have a Q&A question from an anonymous attendee. He asked for any panelist, What part of your analysis is focused on single-parent households? Will your proposed changes work for both married and single-parent households?
That's a great question. We have many, many single parents out there. And I will just share that what I raised as it relates to ensuring that each and every family has access. And by family, that could be a constituted family of whatever you might constitute a family is, which is also a single parent. Unfortunately, to Bridget's point of earlier around the price of care, I mean, the price of care for a single parent is so weighty. If we think about the fact that in many parts of the country, care for an infant or a toddler can be beyond $14,000 a year, I mean, that is a significant amount of money. And so for single parents, not only are they grappling with the price of care, but they're also grappling with the juggling of the accessibility of care. We also have a desert problem in the United States too. You could find care potentially, but it could be 20, 40 miles away, even 10 miles away. And so as you think about, I know that there's always a juggling, who's picking up, who's dropping off, who this day, who that day. You don't necessarily have a village surrounding you, and you're single parent. Pick up and drop offs or non-traditional hour care that Rachel raised earlier is really, really important. So as we're thinking about solutions here, we really need to go back to something I shared earlier, which is solutions need to be centered on the children, families, and communities from which they come. And so we have to pay attention to the very diverse lives and experiences of children and families in order to create a solutions that's centered there around accessibility, affordability, quality, and what we know about child development to inform how we create from birth systems.
You know, if I could just jump in, I think that, you know, Lynette makes all excellent points. And just to build on something that Rachel said earlier, this is where, you know, when you think about solutions, you know, we do have all sorts of different kinds. We have the childcare centers, we have family homes, we have family friend and neighbor, we've kind of got informal care. And one of the things to think about is how to breathe life, how to take those investments and breathe life into the systems that we already have to make them work. Because, you know, there are alternative schedules. There are a number of particularly retail and restaurant workers who also have really unpredictable schedules, and they'll get, you know, their schedules maybe a day or two before. It's very difficult to afford or find childcare that then that would work with that schedule. And so sometimes that's why you need more of those family systems. And so how can you find ways to support what already exists and make that better and really improve the quality there and improve the accessibility so that you're not necessarily everybody off to a childcare center, you know, that might not work for every family. And so I think that that's another important thing to think about, flexibility, you know, and to think about what's already working and how we can build on it to make it work better.
All right. Anybody else out there wants to join us?
This is a message for the audience. If you have a question to ask the panelists, you can go ahead and click the raise your hand button or submit a question in the Q&A.
All right, so I think at the moment we can join to the conversation among you. I clearly got the spirit of what you're saying, but if somebody takes note, I'm not absolutely sure what are your 1, 2, 3, 4 one-sentence recommendations. I know it's painful, but I'm going to go back to you and I want you to summarize. So if Congress and the President does have you here, what's your 1, 2, 3, 4, but not in terms of what's the problem, what would you do? Where would you put how much billion where? Anybody want to start? Elizabeth, go ahead.
Yeah,
You're
so
the economist.
did you ask for how much? How much?
No,
Did you ask for how much?
But give me an order of magnitude. You're talking about 100 billion, you're talking about 500 billion a year, government federal government going into what?
Right. So my first wish list point was to pass a new Voting Rights Act, which is not necessarily going to cost a lot of money. Second, okay, sort of this question of stemming the bleed here, right? Stopping the bleed. You know, probably ballpark. You know, it's certainly well into the billions. Is it 50 billion? I mean, how much do we, just to give you some perspective on billions, because it can get a little bit overwhelming. I'm going to be off here a little bit, but you want to think about a program like Title I of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This is like what the main federal money is for education.
Remind us what that is.
It's the main federal program for education in this country.
What does it do for?
What it does is it's based on allocation of aid to school districts based on child poverty. And it's there to be used to support programs for educationally disadvantaged students. So it was part of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, passed into law by Lyndon Johnson. Yes. So it's about $10 billion.
It's going to be used for what?
No, I'm just trying to give you. I'm just trying to give you a perspective on what billions actually mean here. Here, let me take this because I have these numbers right in front of me. So let me actually.
I'll get back to you. Okay. Anybody else wants to give me the numbers?
I think I just want to say that it's a difficult question to answer because we need to invest immediately and understand the inequities that are happening, the centers that are closing, the family childcare that's closing, the parents that are stressed, the parents that are not working. So when you ask that, I think we need to invest in parents who are not employed right now, being able to be home and not stressed in caring for their children. There's the family childcare and centers that even if they're open, have fewer children attending and may close if we don't. So all of that we need to do, while we also need to think forward to post-COVID, which I anticipate is going to be a very different world than pre-COVID. And that may let us address some of this history that we're talking about that has led us to a mismatch between our 21st century and where we should have been in the 1970s, but where we are now and what we had right now.
Lynette, are you helping?
Yes, so I have a comment to make. And so there actually has been work done on financing the early childhood system. The National Academy of Sciences put out a report a couple of years ago and put forward a pretty big number. Let's just see that the number started with a T as in Tom, not a B as in Bob, right? So it is a very large number. But Rachel, you're right that was calculus done even before the pandemic, where I think that I'm curious about how our colleagues who love numbers, Elizabeth, may weigh in on the implications of the pandemic on the calculus that was done before. But there, I think, in lies another complexity that is important for us to realize in terms of integrated costs.
But just so we can follow, where did the trillion go? Can you tell us?
So it goes to the early childhood workforce. Again, going from an impoverished workforce to a workforce, to Elizabeth's point, that has training and education and supports and infrastructure.
Okay.
It goes to everything from facilities to systems. Rachel raised up the idea of data and data interoperability. We can't put our hands around a problem if we don't know the problem, and the childcare system has an abhorrent childcare data system. So we're sort of grasping at straws in terms of the data that we're able to pull together. It goes to what we know about early childhood systems and family engagement, programs from early Head Start through childcare and subsidized programs. So they're counting a lot within the context of this. But I think one of the most important, areas of focus is this is about also interagency integrated systems of care. When we're talking about children from birth to 5, we're talking about health and wellness. We're talking about early childhood mental health. We're talking about child development. We're talking about workforce supports. We're talking about an issue that has come to the fore a great deal during the pandemic, which is food insecurity. Food insecurity is happening for young children under the age of 5 who did not have access to school. Their children weren't in school yet, but they were being supported by programs like SNAP that so there's a whole host of integrated supports that are needed for both families, communities, and early childhood educators and systems that brings this big number. But given that, the outcomes, I think, can be so contributive to a more robust, healthy community across the country that are more equitable and that help individuals and families thrive in the long run. But we have to make that down payment. We have to make sure that we're putting our concerted effort, because we can't afford to go through this again. Like I said, where's the outrage? I love that. Where's the outrage? 50%. What is that going to do to our economy if families can't have access to the care they need for their children? And not custodial care, quality care that supports families feeling good about and their children feeling good about thriving.
I understand that 49 million Americans will lose their job because they'll have to stay home. That's one figure, which is kind of stunning figure. Mm-hmm. So Bridget, how would you spend $1 trillion?
Yeah, I would just say 100% what Lynette just said. I think you laid it out beautifully. I would also start with paid. Part of what we need to pay for is national paid family and medical leave. Elizabeth raised a good point about how long it should be. We've actually at the Better Life Lab, we've looked into different studies about duration, and you're right. You hit sort of a sweet spot for infant and child health and well-being. It's like 6 months to a year for mothers to be able to return to the workforce and fathers, so that you're not out so long. It's between 6 and 9 months. So I would say spend it on paid family and medical leave of 6 months to a year. Think big, get everybody at the table. It really needs to be human-centered, have parents and caregivers and providers, community members, business leaders. This is something that works for all of us, and we need to have all of those voices coming together to find those solutions. And as far as a price tag, I would go with what Lynette said, the National Academy of Sciences. I think there's a lot we don't know, and I think we have to start going down that path to build the systems together. And we need to be flexible, but definitely center having decent and dignified work for the very important work that our early educators and caregivers do.
So I understand you want the federal government to pay for the workers' leave, not the employers. But I want to get you down to for a moment. In the remaining minutes, we have to talk about equity. And to talk about equity. And so let me start with a true story, which happened quite a few years back in New York City. And in a village, there was a school which had a very highly regarded science teacher. And but there was a budget cut, and the school decided to let the teacher go. And the parents were very upset, and they raised the money to keep it's a public school, to raise the money to keep the teacher. And the chancellor of the New York system said, absolutely not. That would allow schools where there are affluent parents to have privileges and maintain things which schools in other districts could not do. And he ended up by paying from the system budget just to avoid the parents making contribution and getting something other school districts would not have. And so the question, and that comes up, of course, again and again, and the question is, should we, because of course, there have been court decisions, actually from Texas, which require all schools to get the same amount of money. But it's, of course, is what's not happening. So the question is, should we insist that all school districts get the same per capita per child? Or maybe we should say, if the parents want to make extra contribution, half of it should go into general kitty, but some should go to their particular school, or some mix. I add to that, so far I talked about money. Of course, parents give all kinds of other things to quote their school, from computers to time. So how are we going to deal with this question of equity among schools?
I'll just say really briefly, it's a critical question, because the way that we finance education right now is it's part of structural racism, basically. You know, you've already got communities and communities of color who have been, you know, through redlining, denied places where they can, you know, buy houses and build wealth. There's so much discrimination baked into where people live, and then if you create a system then that's based on local property taxes, you've baked inequality and structural racism into your funding plan. So I think it's time to have another big think about, how do we do this? How do we pay for our education in an equitable way? Not being an economist, I'm a reporter, so I'm looking for those answers.
Okay, Elizabeth, the finger's on you.
Yes, so I'd say that how the sort of redistributional formulas are structured is really important for the effects that they have. And so sometimes, I mean, we've gone through, I mentioned local property tax-based finance. That's not really the world we live in anymore. These you know, school funding systems have been challenged. You know, it happened at the Supreme Court level, got kicked back to the states in the 1970s in California. And I think one of the things that we've learned about from then, sort of, you know, state constitutions supporting at least an adequate education and states coming up with formulas to try to generate it, is that how it's done really matters. So for example, the type of formula that existed in California, you know, it still exists, as far as I know, is one where they've made the tax price of education essentially infinite, which means that it's very, like, any local money that's raised is sort of grabbed and redistributed across school districts, all school districts in the state. And so the idea is to create that equality, but it also creates an incentive not to invest at all if you can't capture some of it locally. And so there's been this concern that it's, you know, leveled down the quality of a formula like that can level down the quality of education for everyone. There are other ways to do this, but they also involve, you know, not having as much redistribution, or there still being some inequality, some inequalities that still exist. But no matter what, you know, that formula looks like, parents are still going to sort in a way, you know, that creates, you know, inequality in and of itself. So when I was thinking about this question and the pandemic, I was thinking we're at a crossroads. We can take childcare the direction of education, which has major structural inequalities, yes, but it is free and it is universal. Okay, and we have lots of issues there. Or we can take education the direction of childcare, where, you know, there's a lot of private involvement, and when we get more private involvement, we get even more inequality and even more sorting. So these are kind of things that I would be thinking about here. But to answer your question directly, the structure of the formula matters for how this works. Quite a good deal.
I would just add to that. I mentioned earlier, you know, the COVID setback, and that's what we're seeing suggests that these inequities are being exacerbated. And that means that we're going to need to overinvest in those communities. And it may be that if we can do that from the federal level to address the COVID pandemic, we may be able to get past some of these local inequities and move ourselves forward from there.
Any others?
I would just add, I mean, this is a great discussion, and I would just add, as we're thinking about how to create more equitable systems for our children and families, that equity and equal are not the same thing, and we have to be okay with that. There are inherent structural inequities that live in both the education system and the childcare system, the health system, and other systems. And we, I think, have to have an honest dialogue about what those inequities are and what our tolerance level is as communities to wrap our arms around that very real challenge that Rachel raised up, that they're even being exacerbated more during the pandemic, hard to turn away. They're really in our face. And so how are we going to honestly and directly address and engage those that are on the receiving end of the inequity to help to support renewed vision around systems moving forward? And those are hard discussions and hard conversations to have.
Okay. Well, we have 8 minutes. So what a luxury. Please go ahead, Richard.
I wanted to ask a question, and maybe Brigid could comment on this. We haven't talked as much about the structure of work and flexibility and part-time work and normalizing that variety of work. So I wondered if you might say a little bit more about where that fits in addition to the parental leave that we've talked about, you know, especially I think we've been talking about right after a child is born, but families may need that later and this more variety of work types.
Yeah.
So add a sentence here. I start by saying that the problem from my viewpoint starts when we had once in a situation, the one breadwinner in the family could provide for the family sufficiently so the other breadwinner could focus on, the other partner could focus on childcare. If it's not the spouse, it could be the grandmother, the uncle, or whatever. And then we move to the system where now basically we have two people to have to work in order to make a living wage. But in effect, the system is worse because we now, in effect, drawing on cheap labor from other people. Already talked about the grandparents get pulled in. But now, with that virtual work, we're going to the next step. And we're moving offices from those corporations, for instance, Facebook, permanently now moves people to work from home. That means because now they will have to take part of their home and turn it into an office and will create all this tension between young children at home and their parents. So basically, I think in the end, the conversation comes down to how much the society values the next generation as compared to the stockholders getting a larger return on their investment. And until we have that conversation, I don't see how the other conversation fall into place.
Yeah, you make a really good point. I think that's one of the reasons why, you know, you're beginning to see so many more conversations about, you know, how this is a failed structure. You know, the reliance on the free market system, this a complete obsession with shareholder capitalism. It's time to have a much larger discussion about how to have a dynamic stakeholder capitalism, where you could bring in the care economy, where you could bring in these questions about how you meaningfully combine work and care and make it equitable for people across all genders, across race and class. So I think those are the questions that we need to be asking ourselves as a society. What kind of America do we want to be? What kind of future do we want to be? And I think that that's not just about our children. I think that's about us right now.
But you mentioned earlier, Pat Buchanan. So on that point of stakeholder capitalism, the good news is that There are some now Republicans who are starting to talk about stakeholder capitalism. And Senator Rubio, when he gave an address at the Catholic University, made a rather extensive statement in favor of stakeholder capitalism. And a Business Roundtable, which is the association of the leading CEOs, they came out in favor of stakeholder capitalism. It doesn't mean it's going to happen next week, but it shows some straws going in the direction of the flowing the right direction. Is that what I'm trying to say? So now we are down to 5 minutes. Any last piece of wisdom you want to share with us before we go away?
Well, I would like to just share one thing quickly before we jump off, because we spoke a lot about, I heard a lot about data and landscape and sort of what's happening through the pandemic. So I just felt the need to share that we actually are releasing a report this week, aptly called Picking Up the Pieces. And it's actually combining our annual price of care report and our state fact sheets that we do every year, because of course, the pandemic completely sort of wiped away year-over-year comparison. And so this report is really taking the data across the United States and trying to paint a picture of what childcare looks like right now for parents, for communities, for employers, for providers. And you can download it later this week at childcareaware.org. And would love to continue to have this dialogue about what the art of the possible is in the childcare system, because just like so many systems, considering where we're re-envisioning, this is a moment and a movement I think that's been growing over the last many years to really focus on reconsidering what the childcare system should look like and what early childhood should be.
Would you please repeat how we can download it and when?
Sure. It will be available by Thursday, and it's called the Picking Up the Pieces report. And you can get it at childcareaware.org.
Anybody else has anything, resources they want to point us to?
Well, I did mention the NIER report, NIEER, earlier from Rutgers, who's one of the groups that's been surveying the impact of COVID in the early care and education system.
Okay, at this point, indulge me for a moment before I thank you all and let you go. We need to tell you, the audience, about our next event, so bear with me for a moment. This is our next first 100 days on October 19. And here comes the panel who's going to join us. You can enjoy them, and we have going to be a complete diversity of viewpoints, the full political spectrum. And finally, since we mentioned all kinds of sources, here is one more contribution to the discussion. Our need to pull together as a nation, which I think is necessary in order to achieve any of the things we discussed. So thank you very, very much for taking the time for a thoroughly excellent and thorough discussion, slightly overwhelming, but very much on point. Thank you, and be safe and be well. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.